John Miller had lived a quiet life in his small corner of the neighborhood. His house wasn't the biggest, nor the most polished, but it carried something money couldn't buy: pride. Every brick, every repaired step, every flower bed outside the porch was the result of his own hands. For John, a retired Army veteran, that little home was more than shelter. It was his sanctuary, the place where he finally found peace after years of battles, both on foreign soil and within himself. His days were simple. He watered the roses in the morning, exchanged polite greetings with neighbors, and spent evenings on the porch, sipping tea while watching the sun fade behind the trees. People knew John as a quiet man, someone who carried stories in his eyes but rarely spoke of them. And in truth, he was content with his modest life, living off his small pension and carefully managed savings. Then one afternoon, as he checked his mailbox, an envelope caught his eye. It bore the bold letterhead of the Homeowners Association. He thought it might be a routine notice, perhaps an update about community maintenance or a neighborhood meeting. But when he opened it, his hands froze. His eyes scanned the page again and again. Outstanding dues and fines, $10,000. The figure was written in black ink, sharp and unapologetic. His heart sank. $10,000? On his pension, that was impossible. He sat down heavily on the porch steps, the letter trembling in his hands. For several minutes, the world around him blurred. He could hear the distant laughter of children playing, the hum of a lawnmower from a neighbor's yard, but none of it seemed real. John read further. The letter claimed he owed years of unpaid dues, penalties for an unapproved flag display, overgrown shrubs, and even fines for noise disturbances. He almost laughed bitterly at that last one. Him? A noise disturbance? He was the quietest person on the block. As the sun dipped lower, John's mind swirled with worry. His pension barely covered rent, groceries, and medication. There was no way he could come up with such a sum. And yet, the letter warned of legal action, even foreclosure, if payment wasn't made. That night, John barely slept. He sat at his kitchen table with the letter under the dim yellow light of a single bulb. Memories of his service years returned. Nights spent awake in faraway deserts, long hours of fear and responsibility. Back then, he fought for his country with nothing but grit and determination. Now, in his old age, he was being forced into another kind of battle, this time not with weapons but with paperwork, greed, and injustice. $10,000, he whispered to himself. They really think they can take my home from me? The thought filled him not with despair, but with a slow-burning resolve. He wasn't just any man. He was someone who had faced worse odds and survived. This house was his peace, his comfort, the reward of his sacrifices. He would not let anyone take it away. When the clock struck midnight, John folded the letter carefully, slid it back into the envelope, and placed it inside his worn leather folder, the same one that once held his deployment orders years ago. He closed his eyes, inhaled deeply, and whispered, "If it's a fight they want, it's a fight they'll get. But this time, I won't be the one who loses." And so, with that quiet vow, John prepared to confront the very people who thought they could bully him into silence. He didn't know exactly how yet, but deep inside, he knew one thing for certain. This battle would not end the way they expected. The next morning, John rose early, though his night had been restless. He shaved carefully, buttoned his cleanest shirt, and tucked the HOA letter into his old leather folder. As he looked at his reflection in the mirror, he reminded himself of the countless mornings he had prepared for briefings and missions. Those days had required courage and discipline. This day would require no less. By mid-morning, he walked into the HOA office. The building, a modest brick structure at the end of the block, had a polished exterior that mirrored the board's reputation: cold, glossy, and unyielding. Inside, the air smelled faintly of fresh paint and coffee, yet there was a sharpness to it, the kind that reminded John of interrogation rooms. A long wooden table stretched across the room, where the board members sat like a tribunal. At the center was Martin Lewis, the HOA president, a man with a neatly pressed suit and a reputation for wielding authority like a weapon. On either side of him sat the treasurer, Mrs. Callahan, with her stack of ledgers, and Mr. Dunn, the secretary, who never looked up from his notes but whose pen seemed to record every breath. John stood tall, though his clothes were simple and his shoes worn. He placed the letter on the table. "I received this yesterday," he said evenly. "I'd like an explanation." Martin leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "Mr. Miller, according to our records, you have accumulated unpaid dues and fines over the past several years. $10,000 is what you owe to this community." John raised his eyebrows. "Unpaid dues? I've made every payment I've been billed for. As for fines, what fines?" Mrs. Callahan adjusted her glasses and rattled off a list. "Failure to maintain lawn height, unauthorized flagpole, late payments, noise violations." "That flag," John interrupted firmly, his voice carrying a rare edge, "is the flag of the United States of America. The same flag I served under for 22 years. And you're calling it unauthorized?" The room grew quiet. Even Mr. Dunn paused mid-scribble. But Martin's smirk never wavered. "Rules are rules, Mr. Miller. No exceptions. If you can't afford to comply, perhaps you should consider selling. This community has standards." That sentence cut deeper than the numbers on the page. Selling his home? Giving up his sanctuary? John's jaw tightened, but he didn't lash out. He had learned long ago that silence could be a stronger weapon than anger. He gathered the letter back into his folder. "I won't be paying $10,000 for phantom fines," he said calmly. "If you believe you have a case, take me to court. But know this, I won't be bullied." Martin chuckled, shaking his head. "We'll see how confident you are when the papers arrive." John turned and walked out. His steps were slow, deliberate, but inside his chest, his heart hammered. As he stepped back into the sunlight, the smirk on Martin's face replayed in his mind. That arrogance wasn't just about money, it was about power. On the way home, John's thoughts hardened into resolve. He had faced stronger adversaries than this board. They thought he was powerless, a poor veteran clinging to a pension. But they had no idea that under his quiet exterior lived a man who knew how to plan, how to endure, and how to strike when the moment was right. By the time he closed the gate to his yard, the first seed of a plan had already taken root. They believed they had cornered him, but soon they would learn what it meant to underestimate John Miller. The days following John's confrontation with the HOA board were heavy with tension. Each time he checked his mailbox, he half expected to find a notice of legal action. But instead of waiting for their move, John decided to make his own. Years of military service had taught him a simple lesson. The best defense is often a well-prepared offense. On a quiet Tuesday morning, he took the bus to the county records office. The building wasn't large, but the smell of dust and old paper clung to its walls like history itself. Rows of metal filing cabinets and shelves filled with thick ledgers stretched across the room. Behind the counter, a clerk with tired eyes asked what he was looking for. "I need property records for Oakwood Estates," John said, referring to his neighborhood. The clerk nodded, pointed him to a section, and handed him a stack of files. John carried them to a wooden table near the window, where golden sunlight spilled across the pages. He began flipping through maps, ownership deeds, and tax reports. At first, everything seemed ordinary: houses, lots, transfers. But then, tucked between two folders, something unusual caught his attention. Several parcels of land within Oakwood Estates, open spaces, parking lots, even a walking path, were listed under the HOA's name. That part wasn't surprising, but as he read further, his heart began to quicken. These parcels had delinquent taxes stretching back years, thousands of dollars unpaid, and according to the county notes, they were scheduled to be auctioned in just a matter of weeks. John sat back, stunned. The HOA, the same board that demanded $10,000 from him, hadn't even paid their own bills. They had neglected properties that gave them control over the neighborhood, assuming no one would notice until it was too late. But John had noticed. For a long moment, he simply stared at the papers, the corner of his mouth twitching into something that wasn't quite a smile, but carried a spark of hope. The math in his head was quick. The starting bids for these parcels were only a fraction of what the HOA demanded from him. If he used his savings carefully, maybe even borrowed a little from his old army buddy, he could afford them. As he copied down the auction details, he felt an old, familiar surge inside him. The same feeling he used to get before a mission. Not fear, not nerves, but focus. The board thought they had trapped him with threats and paperwork. But here, in these dusty files, he had found their weakness. Before leaving, he spoke with the clerk again. "These auctions, anyone can bid, right?" "Anyone with the funds," the clerk replied. "Properties go to the highest bidder. Once it's done, it's final." John nodded. Final. That word echoed in his mind. Walking out into the bright afternoon, he felt lighter than he had in weeks. The plan was forming now, sharp and clear. They had demanded $10,000 from a man who barely had enough to get by. But in their arrogance, they had left open a door, and soon John would step through it, not just to defend himself, but to turn the tables entirely. By the time he reached home, he already knew what he needed to do. He pulled out his phone and dialed an old friend, Sergeant Daniels, a man who had stood by him in darker days. "I might need a favor," John said. His voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. "There's something coming up, and I can't afford to lose." That night, as John sat once more at his kitchen table, the HOA letter still tucked neatly in his folder, he no longer felt the crushing weight of defeat. Instead, he felt a rising current of determination. The board thought they were the hunters, circling their prey. But soon, they would realize they had cornered the wrong man. The morning of the auction dawned crisp and bright. John woke before sunrise, the way he had so many times during his service years. Old habits never really died. They simply waited for moments like this. He brewed a pot of coffee, dressed in his best jacket, and tucked a small envelope of cashier's checks into his inner pocket. His savings, carefully stretched and supplemented with a short-term loan from his old army buddy Daniels, were enough to give him a fighting chance. As he locked his front door, he glanced back at his little house. For a moment, doubt flickered. What if he failed? What if he lost everything? But then he remembered the smug grin on HOA President Martin Lewis's face, the dismissive tone of, "Rules are rules," and his doubt hardened into resolve. The county courthouse buzzed with quiet chatter when John arrived. Folding chairs lined the auction room, and a podium stood at the front. Property maps were pinned on the wall, red markers circling each parcel up for bid. Among the crowd, John spotted Martin and two other HOA board members, their suits pressed, their expressions confident. They clearly intended to buy back the delinquent parcels, tightening their grip on the neighborhood. John chose a seat near the back, his folder resting on his lap. He kept his face neutral, though inside his chest his heart pounded with every tick of the clock. At 10 sharp, the auctioneer, a stout man with a booming voice, called the room to order. "First parcel, Oakwood Estates, North Parking Lot, starting bid $500. Without hesitation, Martin raised his paddle. "500! 600, John said calmly, his voice carrying across the room. Heads turned. Martin glanced over, his smirk already forming. 700, Martin countered. 8? The back and forth was quick, but John didn't flinch. He had studied the values, planned his limits, and chosen his battles. When the gavel fell at 900, the first property was his. Whispers rippled through the room. A few neighbors, also present, exchanged surprised looks. The quiet veteran they had always seen tending roses was suddenly bidding with precision, standing toe-to-toe with the very board that had lorded over them. The auction rolled on. A walking path, a small green lot, another parking space. Each time Martin raised his paddle, confident he would outbid John. But John was steady, patient, calculating. He let a few properties go, but the ones that mattered most, the ones that gave access and control, he fought for and won. By midday, John's checks were thinning, but so was Martin's patience. The HOA president's face flushed as parcel after parcel slipped into John's hands. Mrs. Callahan leaned toward him, whispering urgently, but his smirk was gone, replaced by clenched jaws and frustration. Finally, the auctioneer announced the last property. Oakwood Estates Central Lot. Key access to community facilities. Starting bid, $2,000. Martin shot his paddle into the air. 2,000. 2,500, John said, his voice even. 3,000, Martin barked. 35. 4,000. A hush fell over the room. The bidding war was sharp now, each number hitting like a hammer. John's pulse raced, but he didn't break eye contact with the auctioneer. 4,500, he said. Martin hesitated. Sweat beaded his forehead. Mrs. Callahan tugged at his sleeve. Finally, with a frustrated exhale, Martin slammed his paddle down on the table. The gavel struck. Sold to Mr. John Miller. For a heartbeat, silence filled the room. Then whispers rose again, louder this time, mingling with nods of approval from a few neighbors. John exhaled slowly, relief and quiet triumph washing over him. The same man they had tried to bleed dry for $10,000 now held ownership of nearly half the neighborhood's shared spaces. As John left the courthouse, the autumn air felt fresher than ever. He walked past Martin, who avoided his gaze, his face pale with disbelief. For the first time in weeks, John allowed himself a small smile. They thought they had cornered him. Instead, he had turned the tables completely. The days following the auction felt like a quiet storm passing through the neighborhood. At first, there was disbelief. Neighbors whispered in hushed tones, "Did you hear? John Miller owns the parking lots now, and the walking path, too." Some shook their heads in amazement. Others smiled with a kind of secret satisfaction. For years, many had grown weary of the HOA's heavy hand, but no one had ever dared to challenge them. Until John. The board tried to maintain appearances. Martin Lewis still walked around with his clipboard, pretending his authority hadn't been shattered. Mrs. Callahan still sent letters, but everyone knew things had changed. Without control of the common spaces, their power was weakened, and the man they had once mocked as powerless was now the quiet owner of half their neighborhood. John, however, did not flaunt his victory. He didn't strut or boast. That wasn't his way. Instead, he spent the first week after the auction meeting with neighbors, one by one. Mrs. Evans, the widow who had been fined for having wine chimes on her porch. The Thompsons, who had once been threatened for letting their children's bicycles rest on the sidewalk. John listened to their stories, nodding with the patience of a man who knew the sting of unfairness all too well. "I'm not here to punish anyone," he told them. "I just want people to live without fear of letters and fines." When the first community gathering came, John stood not behind a polished table, but in the small park he now owned, surrounded by neighbors sitting in folding chairs. His voice was calm, steady, but carried the weight of someone who had nothing to prove. "The HOA demanded $10,000 from me," he began. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. They thought I was weak, that I would bend. But I didn't. And because I didn't, I now own the very spaces they used to control you with. But this ownership, it isn't about me. It's about us. From today, no one here will be fined for flags, or flowers, or bicycles. This neighborhood will be a place of respect, not fear." For a long moment, silence hung in the air. Then, slowly, people began to clap. It wasn't loud at first, but it grew, echoing across the park until it felt like the entire neighborhood was standing with him. Martin, watching from a distance, turned and walked away. The smirk he once wore was gone forever. That evening, John returned to his garden. The roses had begun to bloom again, their petals catching the fading light of the sunset. He sat on his porch with a cup of tea, The same porch where weeks earlier he had sat in despair with a letter demanding $10,000. Only now, there was peace in his heart. He thought of the battles he had fought overseas, the comrades he had lost, the weight he carried every day. Compared to those, this battle had been small, but it mattered, because it reminded him and everyone who watched that dignity is not measured in wealth or status. It is measured in the quiet strength to stand when standing seems impossible. As the sky turned shades of orange and purple, John whispered softly, almost to himself, "They tried to take from me. Instead, they gave me everything." And with that, the veteran leaned back, letting the evening breeze wash over him. He had won not just land, not just freedom from unfair rules, but something far greater, the respect of his neighbors, and the peace of knowing he had turned injustice into justice with nothing more than patience, courage, and resilience.